we're not so afraid of hell anymore and of damnation, even for ourselves. We live very lax lives. And it's a dangerous situation, especially when we have people like Father Barron or Bishop Barron taking up the philosophy that there's a reasonable hope that all will be saved. There is no such hope, and it's certainly not reasonable. There's a few articles recently written about hell, and I think it might be good for us to read a couple of them because they're good and they're responsible. Eric Salmon, the good editor of Crisis Magazine Online, said that modern Catholics live under the assumption that hell is mostly empty, but doing so radically impacts our ability to fulfill the Great Commission. It's not radically empty. He writes, the recently deceased Cardinal George Pell, a prince of the church, if there ever was one. That's my comment. The recently deceased Cardinal George Pell wrote a few years ago about his evolving views. I wish this would be the case with Bishop Barron and others who hold this view, who hold the erroneous view that there's a reasonable hope. Cardinal Pell wrote a few years ago about his evolving views on the question of how many will be saved. In the 1970s, he subscribed to a broadly inclusivist view of salvation. As he put it, I expressed the hope, perhaps expectation, that few would be consigned to hell. He was not alone. During the time following the Second Vatican Council, although the trend began before the Council, a movement arose within the Church to downplay any talk of hell, and specifically to assume and even affirm that most people would end up in heaven. I tell you, beloved, going to church, I don't know when I've heard a sermon on hell. And specifically to let me continue here. Vatican II itself appears to support this movement by declaring those also can attain to salvation who through no fault of their own do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, yet sincerely seek God and moved by grace strive by their deeds to do his will as it is known to them through the dictates of conscience. That's Lumen Gentium 16. I'm not suggesting that's wrong. Vatican II was not a was a pastoral council, not a doctrinal one. It did not profess any new doctrine. That is a true teaching of the Church. And so Eric Salmon says, while the council's language leaves open the question of who qualifies under these conditions, in other words, what exactly does it mean to sincerely seek God if one is not baptized? The assumption by the majority of theologians, pastors, and lay people was that most qualify. Thus, all the circles of hell were swept out, making the pit of eternal fire the destination of only the worst men in history. Essentially, hell was the home of Hitler, Stalin, and a few others, but definitely not your Hindu neighbor or your fallen-away son-in-law.